Good evening, everybody. My name is Marie Dorigny. I am the Administrative Director of the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination at Reed Hall in Paris. And I'm delighted to be introducing this event today. This event is called Is There a European Identity? And it's part of a 12 event series on the future of Europe. It was conceived and created jointly by the European Institute, the Columbia Global Centers in Paris, and the Alliance program. I'm very honored to introduce the moderator of today's discussion, my colleague, Mark Mazower. Mark is the Ira D. Wallach Professor of History at Columbia University, and he specializes in modern Greece, 20th century Europe, and international history. He comments on international affairs and reviews books for the Financial Times, The Nation, the London Review of Books, the New York Review of Books, and others. In 2016, he made a film called Techniques of the Body, a meditation on the refugee crisis in Greek history with the director Konstantin Gennaris. And his most recent book is What You Did Not Tell, a Russian past and the journey home, that was published by the Other Press in 2017, a family history. He is the founding director of the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination, which opened at Reed Hall in Paris in the fall of 2018, and which brings together scholars with leading artists, writers, composers, and filmmakers from around the world. Mark, I will hand it over to you so you can introduce the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie, and welcome everybody. Welcome everybody to this conversation, which is dependent to a conversation that happened a few days earlier between Thierry Grillet and Felwine Sarr on the same subject of European identity. I'd like to introduce our speakers, but before I do, I just want to share with you the unfortunate news that Deborah Levy will not be joining us this afternoon because she had a family crisis, and so she sends her apologies, but we will nevertheless, I'm sure, have an interesting conversation that I'm looking forward to. Let me introduce briefly each of the three speakers, and then we will start and get the ball rolling. So let me begin with Magali Bessone, welcome, who is a professor of philosophy at Panthéon, Sorbonne, the author of several books and a large number of articles. She works on contemporary theories of justice. She's written about rules, I think. You've written about Du Bois. She works on critical theories of race, on questions of tolerance and multiculturalism, all of which seem to be apposite for today's subject. Then we have Riva Kastoryano, who is an emeritus senior researcher at the CNRS. Welcome, Riva, teaching at Sciences Po, a PhD in sociology from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales. She's also, I think, still a visiting professor at the New School for Social Research in New York. And she covers a wide range of topics in political sociology, from transnational nationalism, multiculturalism. She's written on Turkey. She's a wonderful book published by her, a really original book, Burying Jihadis, that I thought was sensationally original, actually. So I'm looking forward very much to hearing what you have to say. And then great pleasure to have my colleague Mark Lilla join us, who is the Professor of Humanities at Columbia University and well known to many of you from his books and his articles in the New York Review of Books, Professor of Humanities at Columbia, who taught for many years on the Committee on Social Thought at Chicago and at New York University. Welcome, all three of you. We have to discuss this slippery question that I don't quite know how to hold or to get my hands on, the question of European identity. I, on the whole, tend to run away whenever I come across the phrase European identity, but perhaps you'll persuade me that I shouldn't do that. And one of the reasons that I should be grateful to the organizers of today's conversation is it sent me back to a document that I didn't know existed, which was the European Community's 1973 Declaration on European Identity. I'm ashamed to admit that I didn't know of its existence, but I was rereading it. This was, of course, a long time ago, when they were closer to the Second World War than they were to us. And it was a small organization of 9 states. And they talk about unity. Unity as an achievement, unity as a necessity, as they put it, to ensure the survival of the civilization. And then they go into the usual checklist of European values that they're determined to preserve: representative democracy, the rule of law, social justice, respect for human rights. All this, of course, at a time when there were still dictatorships in the Iberian Peninsula and in Greece, and when the Iron Curtain was very much in existence. And they talk too about fundamental elements of the European identity. There's been no shortage of European identity talk since then, sometimes initiated from the top, and sometimes seeming to well up from somewhere below. And so perhaps we can we'll start with this discourse, Magali Bessone. Perhaps you can tell us to what extent you've found the term useful in your own work, and what you think the things are that we should bear in mind when we talk about it.
Well, thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation. So it's very interesting that you mentioned that you find the term slippery, because that's exactly what I had in mind when I was asked to think about, is there a European identity? And I personally don't like the notion of collective identity. I try to never use it either. And I'm very dubious about the need and use of the notion itself of European identity. So I don't know if I'm the right person to convince you that it's helpful in order to think about the European Union. So what I was thinking when preparing this talk is that it's probably useful indeed in order to understand what we may want to mean with European identity. It's probably useful to use a sort of Wittgensteinian method and try to see how it's used, when it's used, and in order to mean what type of thing in what type of context. And what I found particularly interesting is that right now, really the notion of European identity is particularly used in an exclusionary sense by people who call themselves the political group Identity and Democracy, which was launched in the European Parliament in June 2019. And this Identity and Democracy group, which comprises the French Rally in France, Vlaams Belang in Belgium, or Alternative for Germany, or the Salvini League in Italy, these people are very, very adamant that there is something as a European cultural identity. They think that there is a strong need for calling for a European cultural identity with very blurry characteristics. And that's also something that's very interesting. So the characteristics are essential. They are inherited from a somewhat fantasized past or a mythic past. And then it might come from ancient Greece, or Christian Middle Age, or the 18th century Enlightenment. You don't know really, but it's very important that we have a cultural heritage. And from this past, continuously, I mean, with a sort of sense of continuity, now we have a sort of homogeneous, close, patrimonial culture common to all European people. And they are the ones who also exactly at the same time and with the same type of words, etc., profess a very strong skepticism for a common political identity. So on one hand, they defend the existence and the essential existence, I mean, with essential characteristics of cultural identity. And on the other hand, they are very skeptic about the need, the value, the importance, the meaning of a common political identity. And this is what we call the identitarian bloc or the identitarian politics. And this is exactly the European identity I fear, and the European identity I really would not like to be meaningful or to work for us as Europeans. In one very important aspect, this cultural identity, as opposed to a political identity, is simply, as I said it earlier, an exclusionary identity. That is, it's a way to say we versus them. And it's a way to unite some countries simply in order to exclude other countries. So it's an identity against, it's a defensive identity. So it doesn't need to be very coherent, because it's always anyway an identity that is professed in order to push back some people that we really don't want among us or with us. So in this sense, the very idea of identity is used in order to reject others on one hand, and to reject multiple, diverse, complex, dynamic processes of identification, which would be the political meaning of identity. And in order to not commit myself to the notion of collective identity, I'd rather call it a community, or maybe, community seems to me to be safer. And in this sense, the type of processual identification that I would see happening in Europe and for Europe is a political project that could translate into very strong legal European citizenship that would not put the emphasis on the union, but on the citizens. Okay. And I think that they didn't do that in 1973 in the text you mentioned.
Well, maybe I can bring Riva Kastoryano in at this point, because I take the point about the issue that you have with the notion of identity. I'm curious to explore the European bit of the European identity as well. And it, it occurs to me that, for instance, in the early 1940s, there was certainly the right in Europe was quite comfortable talking a certain language of Europe around Berlin and around Rome, and the left was also comfortable talking a very different kind of language of Europe. So one does not necessarily need to feel that this is the talk of Europe is a lost cause. And I can't help thinking, Riva, of my own experiences growing up in England, where there are different, their identity or identity ascriptions have different kinds of capacities to them. And so if you were a sort of North London Jewish boy growing up in the 60s and 70s, you were quite unlikely, if you were asked, to describe yourself necessarily as English, but you were very likely to describe yourself as British. British was a capacious identity that you felt quite at home in. Is there any particular reason why European can't be a capacious identity like British rather than an exclusionary identity like English?
First of all, thank you for the invitation and the introduction. And I was wondering in the 90s if there is what kind of identity we can imagine for Europe. And you didn't mention, but I have this collective book, What Identity for Europe? And I was wondering, the debate was around multiculturalism, as multiculturalism dividing the nations, dividing the political communities. And I was wondering if the multiculturalism can be a model for a European identity. At that time, there was not many books or articles on the identity issue concerning the European Union. And I will join Magali saying that I considered Europe as a political project. And as a political project, I thought that maybe an identity for Europe can lead us to share a common citizenship, the European space being a common good that we can share, and then discuss the multiculturalism, all these different cultures, different languages, regions, and nationalities even. And that time the debate came with the Maastricht Treaty. The real identity issue came with the Maastricht Treaty and the discussion on citizenship of the Union and what kind of citizenship it was, the post-national citizenship defended by some political theorists. And then came the Constitution. The debate on the Constitution brought an identity. Civilization was at the core, culture was at the core, and this was much more exclusionary. Who will be in, who will be out. And personally, I prefer to define myself as European rather than as one nationality. But this is, of course, a personal choice because I want to be beyond any. You can be British, but I cannot be I cannot define an imperial identity. But a European identity was something that, and the idea, an identity for Europe based on this political project, on its normative power, would have been some shared identification rather to a project that was the basis for identity for me. And
no, please.
You want to say something? No.
Yes.
So, and with the debate on, and when Magali was saying about inclusion and exclusion, yes, you mentioned the book on Turkey. The Turkish membership was a real debate for identity of Europe. The exclusion would be on what basis? Is it geographical? Is it philosophical? Is it religious? Is it cultural? So then all the ambiguity around an identity for Europe came up. It's much easier to define an identity by exclusion than by inclusion. So who to include is not an issue, but who to exclude defines an identity for Europe. And that was a big challenge for Europe to define itself as a political project versus a cultural or civilizational project. And
So, well, maybe I can bring in Mark, but then everybody should feel free to jump in as well. Mark, I mean, one of the things that strikes me about the discussion around European identity is how heavily constructivist it is. There's this huge energy into constructing something. Misplaced or not, I don't know, but you've written eloquently about identity politics and about the limitations of identity politics. Perhaps you could just give us your view on this debate. You know Europe extremely well. Do you think is this something that you've thought about? Is it a category that works for you?
Yeah, well, I think Riva began to state something that was close to what I wanted to say to begin. Let me first back up and say that the first question to ask is why everyone is concerned about identity today, which is, I think, what you're asking, Mark, to begin with. And what kind of societies have we become such that people pose to themselves this question of identity? And you might toss off a quip saying that people who have strong identities do not talk about them. And so clearly, it would never occur to them to pose the question. And so the first thing to ask is first thing to inquire about, I think, is to where European societies are right now, Western societies, and then in other societies as well, such that this language of identity has some kind of resonance. And so therefore, we need to begin by looking at what might be absent. And that is absence of all sorts of other ties that used to be given or taken as given before, beginning with familial ties, going up to national ties, and so on. And and what's particularly striking to me about the use of the word, rather than the word identification, which Riva used, is that it presumes a kind of, or implies that we have a little homunculus within ourselves, a little self within ourselves that is our identity. It's a thing, or it's a plant that has to be watered. It's something that's cultivated. And that's quite different from an identification. I'm a fan of the University of Michigan football team. When they lose, they're sad and I'm sad. I identify with the team. But is being a fan of the University of Michigan football team part of my identity? Not at all, right? And so there are two questions asked. There are two ways of looking at the question in regards to Europe. One is in terms of identity in this strong sense. The other is in the sense of identification. So just to talk about identification, in 2010, I happened to be in Shanghai when there was the Shanghai Expo. And I don't know if any of you were there or had seen pictures of these extraordinary pavilions that every country made, except the United States, which turned it into a kind of food court. And magnificent Chinese one, which was an upside down pyramid. The Saudi Arabian one was quite beautiful. And then there was one for the EU. And it was about the size of two little trailers, like in trailer parks. And you walked in and the walls were covered with blue and there were a few of those European stars there. And then you walked through this little maze with videos that were showing, numbers like how much trade has increased and so on a background of flags flying in Brussels. I get to the end of it, and there's a little stand where I can buy European trinkets. So the little yellow European star attached to I think I bought the one that was a keychain. And I walked out, and that was European identity, as opposed to these other magnificent buildings. And so I think that what's crucial for self-government in any republic or any democracy is that people identify with the state or the nation to the extent that is necessary for them to make sacrifices for others. That when you identify to a collective, you have some skin in the game. You're willing to be taxed for other people. You're willing to see services delivered. You're willing to be inclusive and to bring people in. But if you don't have some kind of identification with an institution, a political institution, you don't have much to rely on to get people to sacrifice for others. And that's what's striking me, and I talk about this in my book, The Once and Future Liberal, is that the liberal left would like to have a very active state in which services are provided, people are brought in, and so on, but are skittish about the psychological state of identification with the nation or the government. You can't have it both ways. If you want active government, if you want a strong sense of responsibility in the state, you must have some sense of identification with the whole.
But Mark, can I stop you for a second and question the analogy? Because I can see the argument for a particular state, a particular republic. The European Union is a very strange beast.
Yeah.
It may well be that many people in the union, at the top of the union, would like it to be a republic, but it certainly hasn't been. And yet there have been fairly significant examples of burden sharing already. From the common agricultural policy to social policy to the latest COVID aid packages and so on. It's very striking to me that without actually a great sense of being all European in some strong cultural sense, nevertheless, this funny composite organization works. And so maybe what all this discussion about European identity is really about is very practical things that we've already touched on to some extent, such as who else should be admitted into the club, in particular should Turkey, what internal rules should be defended in the name of what values, i.e. when should you tell the Polish government or the Hungarian government that they have gone to, those actually are very practical questions, and then the European identity thing gets wheeled out as a way of helping to try to find answers to those questions. So I throw that open to everybody, really. Maybe some of this is about just helping the union tackle some real issues that it faces. But the problem is that it gets bound up in all these sorts of questions about, you know, should we defend Mozart, or who is at the heart of Europe, which seem to be very extraneous to the basic questions.
If I can just say that quickly before others speak, that was the next part of that was the next thing I was going to say is the European Union is not a republic. So to what degree do we need this identification? Or whether the model is really a kind of Tocquevillian self-interest properly understood. And that the reason we bail out Greece is not because we identify with the European project or something cultural, but because if we don't, then there are going to be consequences for us. It's striking, though, that there are sort of trans-political identities that have become, or identifications that have become significant. When I was thinking about responding today, it struck me that a much more powerful flag in Europe that one sees that people identify with, that's not a national flag, is not the European Union flag. It's the LGBT rainbow flag. That has become a source of identification globally for all sorts of people that have motivated action. And I think that's a new development we need to think about in thinking about what kind of identities and connections there are out in the political sphere today. That's all.
Thank you. Riva, I see you nodding. Please just jump
Yes.
in.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I agree with you in concerning identity and identification. When I talk about identification concerning the European Union, I think of action. I think of a political participation. I think of participating into values. And I'm very happy that you brought the LGBT, because this is the rainbow, the flag, the European flag doesn't mean anything. May 9 doesn't mean anything. This 9th Symphony of Beethoven doesn't mean anything for Europeans. But the action to take part of a project can be done through an identification, not through an identity. So that's why I use the term, it's in the action, in the participation, in the motivation, in the participating in this project that is a basis for identification, or an identification basis for participation. So the same, today the universal value is not, the universal mobilization, as you say, is not the European Union, is not participating in the construction of this Europe totally in crisis. But maybe some other issues like LGTB, like climate change issues, etc., that will make an involvement in the project that will create an identification with the project, not with an entity. It's not a state, it's not a nation. We know that Europe is not some defended a federal state, some defended an identity, a political community, none of that. But a project in which I want to take part, and I want to identify myself and show that I want to take part. This is why I use the term identification rather than identity. What is a European identity? What identity for Europe? What can be? How can we imagine an identity on such a diverse, heterogeneous, multiple, in many ways, societies and nations and peoples to some extent? Can we talk about a European people as well? So all this identification will summarize a much more a political project rather than an utopian maybe, but a project rather than an identity that will be fixed or maybe flexible as well, moving from one space to another, but taking the project as it is and to develop it and to bring to give all its normative value, to sense to all its normative value as an ideal universalistic project. That's why I use the term identification rather than identity, which I don't see one common identity to Europe.
Maybe I can throw one other thing. Magali, please.
Yes, I completely agree with what was just said. And I just wanted to add something that the good thing is, I don't think that we need the cultural identity or even the notion of identity in order for Europe to achieve its political goals or its political project or itself as a political project. But I understand, I mean, I hear also what Mark was saying about the idea that you need something that justifies that people pay taxes for others. And that is something that you indeed need, the sharing of benefits and burdens within something that is a political community. But indeed, as you mentioned, I think that we do have that in Europe, and we don't need a feeling of identity or common identity in order to have something that I'd rather call solidarity or reciprocity. And you can have such involvement or commitment to burden sharing and benefits sharing because of something that is solidarity. And solidarity is not something that is necessarily grounded or based on identity or strong or thick identity, as some people call it. You can have a feeling of solidarity or the importance of solidarity based on common experiences, and I would say common political experiences. That is, you can have solidarity between classes of people or groups of people, of vulnerable people, sharing domination, sharing all sorts of difficulties, but you can also have solidarity based on values. And in this sense, if you can manage to create solidarity based on common values, political commitments, principles, you can even have something that is a solidarity that expands across borders. And in this capacity, and I think we do have the possibility of creating this type of solidarity with vulnerable classes of people within Europe, then you can also have something that would be a cosmopolitan threshold or a cosmopolitan project in the making for Europe. And what do we have in Europe that makes me think that we can bet on solidarity? Political institutions that people can adopt in order to make claims. And I think that's very important. The institutional part is very important. And for that reason, but we can come back to that later, but political institution or constitution seems to me something that is really important for the European Union. But you need institutions, you also need something more informal, that is the type of social interaction based on mutual joint production of common goods or collective goods. And again, I think that we have that within Europe. And 3, values, that is, representative, I mean, the basic values that you mentioned at the beginning of the session, representative democracy, equal respect, and human rights. I mean, basic common core values.
But when you say basic common core values, this is where I start to ask myself, what is it we are doing? Are we describing a state of affairs? Are we describing a set of inheritance? Are we engaged in a project? And if so, why shouldn't other people be engaged in a very different project in the name of the same outcome, namely European identity? And what difference would being engaged in all these different projects make to the business of different states and peoples in Europe getting on? Do you see what I'm saying? you say we have these core values, and I think to a certain extent you're right. 50 years ago, we didn't in Europe, or 80 years ago, we didn't.
I think that Mark wants to speak, but no, I just want to say, I'm not saying we have these common core values as, you know, a very obvious practice or type of actions, to use Riva's word, which I really like also. I think it's actions rather than symbols that make Europe. But no, I think we want to have a future-oriented project, political project, in which we would together defend these common core values. I'm not saying that these common core values, again, come from the past, or that we are sitting very calmly and on these values. I think they always have to be reasserted and reenacted, because I think values are only things that you make happen, you know, and they are not things that you can rest on.
Mark,
well, yeah, I'd like to push back a little against what Magali just said, and also, in a sense, argue against myself a little bit. And that is that all this talk of values, I think, just ignores how it is that people learn values. They learn values through affect. They learn values through feeling, not by being taught principles. And I've never understood the, to me, exaggerated fear of national feeling in Europe in recent decades, when national feeling is incredible social capital. Why would you want to throw that away? It's a given there that people will feel something for each other. And it's possible, once you have a feeling, then to redirect it through argument, through education, and so on. But there's a kind of hidden rationalism behind all of this that we don't apply to our kids. When we look at communities outside of Europe and outside of the West, we find those bonds to be wonderful and rich and contributing to a good life. We develop romantic longings for that. But when it comes to ourselves, we simply have, it seems to me, need to get over this instinctive hostility to national feeling and instead try to enlighten it and direct it. But we are lacking in social capital increasingly in our advanced societies. There's an atomization of social life, beginning with the family and in local communities, and it's exacerbated by a globalized economy that can, you know, shift the fortunes of a town or a region instantaneously by moving capital around. So I want to make a case for national feeling and for putting in relation to the European project, but not to throwing it away. It's simply, I think, psychologically naive to simply talk about these values that we can teach and expect they're going to motivate action.
please, Riva.
Yes, I was thinking, I agree with Mark when he says that you cannot teach this. I mean, you cannot learn through institutions, you know, all these values. Although European Union, formed by these supranational institutions and their normative power, try to do that. And this is, I think, where the mistake is. The most abstract and most the core value of the European Union, if we say that it's human rights, this is the word that comes everywhere. And like, I forget his name now, the professor of law at NYU who writes about the human rights and the European Constitution, European law. Oh, anyway. So, and when he says that the human rights is just state-oriented, but human rights is a normative discourse, normative value, and all the European Union is based on these supranational institutions who impose this normative value on states, on nations, on people, on communities. So, but I think the mistake, not the mistake, but the failure of the European identity or an identity for Europe is that this normative value does not take part of the citizen's life. So where does this value come in the citizen's life? Through feelings, maybe, I didn't think in these terms, but through a kind of education, much a smaller space of education, rather this supranational normativity imposed on states and from states to individuals, or the other way around, from individuals reporting to supranational institutions and waiting for a reaction against these national feelings or against states. So I think the European identity brings us to think in multiple levels of individuals, of community, local community, of nation, of state, and something that embraces all of it, that we called it values, and we give this responsibility of values to supranational institutions, and without any direct influence of citizens and their everyday life and their everyday and on their feeling with regard to Europe in terms of, sorry again, identification with the European project.
You know, it's interesting that Mazzini, who was, of course, very sensitive to the question of national feeling, saw no contradiction between being an ardent nationalist and an ardent European as well. I think the feelings were very much within the nation, and yet at the same time, for him, and yet at the same time, the cooperation among Europeans was very meaningful. But we have a couple of questions that listeners are starting to send in, and I invite other listeners to send them in if they want to. So maybe I can try out one or two on the panelists, and feel free to respond if you would like to. So one picking up, Magali, what you were saying, in regards to Magali's comments, can we say that European Union institutions are playing the central role in implementing a European identity? To take up something that we've just been talking about, is that part of the phenomenon here, that that this is all coming from a number of the impetus has been coming from a number of centralized institutions at the European level?
So I'm not sure I understand the question, or at least I think there are at least two ways to reply. One is some sort of empirical reply. As you mentioned, the first time the term European identity appeared was in 1973, where it was indeed an endeavor of the 9 country members of the time to create something that would be a European identity in order to foster European integration. So from that point of view, yes, we can say that the idea, or some of the idea of European identity was created by, or was coined at least by an institution in order to serve some goal, some objective, and that would be to form a more perfect union. I mean, to use another context. But as I said, I'm not really convinced that we need anything as a European identity in order, or in a very strong, thick cultural sense of the term, in order to commit ourselves to a European community or a European project, which I think can really work in a much more fluid manner, and accepting the diversity, the plurality of several dimensions of the many identities of people who are members, I mean, ordinary members, individual members of the European Union, who may be sometimes French and sometimes women and sometimes transgender and sometimes Jewish, to name just a few of these other collective identities which were mentioned in the conversation earlier. And I think all these is fine, because identities are by definition multiple, fluid, and contextual. From that, and I would just like to add something about the idea of values and feelings, because I was really interested by your remark, Mark. Yeah, I don't think I really don't think that people learn values indeed, I mean, top down, or because they are taught to have or hold such and such value. Or if they do, indeed, it has to be a very complex way of learning it through a type of moral education. And moral education, as we know, indeed needs feelings. And from that point of view, I'm very human. And I think that we need to have both norms, values, and feelings in order to have a much more complex moral economy of our times. But values are, at the end, the things or something that we want to defend. And I think that that's how I would defend a value, something that we want to defend because we together, and the we is important, we together want to say that it has a specific or special significance for us. We want to defend it. And we have to learn how to want to defend a value. And this is where I agree, feelings come into play. But I think that there is not necessarily an opposition between both values and feelings. And I think that feelings can be political too. So there is no opposition between feelings and politics, or a political project and the moral feeling or moral education. But that's just maybe another conversation.
So there's a question about globalization, which and its impact, its possible impact on this. And I just wanted to elaborate myself a little bit about that. Mark, you said, we exist in this very unforgiving landscape of global vulnerability where entire communities can find themselves pauperized by seemingly anonymous decisions instantly. So I suppose the question arises are there going to be functions for Europe in the future that have not existed in the past, that are produced by the dilemmas of globalization, by the advantages of solidarity among states, against what's clearly a new powerful economic threat, relatively new powerful economic threat from China, for instance. Global warming would be another, and so on. Is the impetus to find the things that Europeans share going to intensify in coming years?
Yeah, well, certainly there's the incentive there. And so, you hear different European leaders speaking differently, but to take the example of Macron, he obviously wants to think of Europe as a kind of united force economically / politically against the United States and China, so it can stand its own and not experience the pauperization that you're talking about. But if that then becomes the raison d'être of the European Union, then it seems to me you are obliged to move more in the direction of trying to instill and cultivate this feeling of identification. And obviously everyone talks about this. It requires more transparency in the institutions. And so I find, as an outside observer, sort of these contradictory either feelings or ends. One is to think of Europe as a state, which would require certain things, and the other is to think of it instead as a kind of union sharing certain values and all the rest. And there are some discourses and actions that feed into one, sometimes into the other. But I don't sense from the outside any consensus about where the locus to that resistance to globalization ought to be, whether at the European or the national level.
Well, I wonder in that connection whether Brexit is going to make any difference, because now we have a laboratory test.
Exactly.
And how Brexit is being read in the European Union, and how the impact of Brexit will affect how people in Europe think about common values. Do you have any thoughts about that?
No, I'm interested in it because yeah, it's this interesting petri dish. And one has to remember that, numerically they probably aren't significant, but in cultural significance, that there were a lot of left Brexiteers, a lot of them, and who were arguing for more economic autonomy precisely because they're worried about the kind of capitalism that we live with now. So I really think it's the place to watch.
Riva, did you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I just want to pick up the two things here, that Europe is not a state, coming back to the supranational institutions, can supranational institutions work like national institutions to unify or to create a political community that is unified? And if the Brexit comes just to change this this aspect of the political community, that is a falling apart community to some extent. And it's a big challenge for Europe and for Macron as well to face globalization with this kind of Europe that is falling apart to some extent, this European crisis in many ways. Within Europe, different nationalist populist parties fighting himself against this kind of existence in France and Iran. And this is a big challenge. Macron wanted to take over Merkel's ambition of creating one unified Europe and the big Europe. We cannot have Europe first like America first, but it's a big challenge for Europe to face this globalization, since we must be honest, Europe doesn't exist in international politics. Europe does not exist in the Middle East. Europe does not exist it doesn't exist. When you gave the example of China, if this big foire in China, then the European flag was so tiny and so invisible to some extent, didn't mean anything. It's not a coincidence. Politically, in international politics, Europe does not exist. So, and it does not exist as Europe. There's no European army, there's no European foreign policy, there's nothing that unifies Europe as a whole to face something that is global. And what is global within Europe, I would say, to bring in the transnational networks, what makes Europe more global is all these transnational networks traveling from all over and bringing to, looking at the migration from a migration perspective. Let me bring this in too, and how Europe brings in the home countries that makes Europe maybe bigger, because these populations circulate around. So what makes Europe globalized to some extent is the circulation within and without Europe, rather than European Union as a project itself.
There may be another factor that another question gets at that complicates things further, and that's the question of generations. And the questioner suggests that this is important because the generation that formed young elites in the 60s and 70s and 80s were inclined to have very, very powerful historical consciousness of the value of European cooperation. The war was near enough to them, it had a meaning. But the generation that is now in charge and coming into power doesn't have those experiences and has a very different, in some ways more parochial, set or more global set of backgrounds. I mean, the state heads of Europe are filled with former McKinsey consultants who all speak the same global language of capital with a very self-prescribed and restricted understanding of what they can do as politicians. And without the commitment at anything more than a strategic level to the value of European cooperation. So it would be interesting to if you have any thoughts about how the succession of generations is playing a role here. It's open to anybody, really.
You have Adrian Fabel's book on Europe and Europeanization, and it shows how the process of not identification, but using European space as a whole space is much more an elite phenomenon, and elite phenomenon for all generations. And now for the young generation, I wonder to what extent they don't go through this tension or contradiction between national feelings and Europeanization through education, through exchanges, but at the same time, the new young generation identifying themselves much more with national phenomenon and with much more in populist, answering their national anxiety with a populist approach among the young generation, which is high, as we see during the elections. So there's this tension between the elite and populism that Europe is torn, I would say.
Yeah, I was struck. I taught at Sciences Po fall before last, so 2019, and I was struck by, and I was doing a course on political reaction, and so we were reading all these works from the 20th century, and it was so it really brought out students' views about politics. It was very striking to me, as I think Mark was hinting at, is that. Not only was there a kind of resistance to thinking about national identity because of concern about minority groups, so there is a kind of identity politics that's there, but also how globalized they are in another sense, in the sense of, speak an older language in an uprooted sense, that their music is international. The books they read, they were mainly on the left, but not all, had an international scope. All these, students I had on the left who were reading all these polity press books and that are translated or not, and sort of they belonged to a kind of saw themselves, or I saw them as seeing themselves as part of a global left. And so one of the interesting phenomena I think we're experiencing right now is that we're seeing, and with the decline of identification with the nation and it not being replaced by some European superstructure, that it's not just economic relations that are being globalized. It's taste, it's politics, it's passions. And so you have there's been an internationalization of identity politics that kids and it's generational, that share in all these different places. Similarly, on the right, you have an internationalization of nationalism, that there are groups on the right that are nationalistic that are in contact with each other. And they feed off of each other because they read the same sorts of books and things like that. And I'm not sure what to say about that, but it does seem to be a generational shift there. And so that would seem to mean it would be one more barrier to young people being identified just to Europe, as opposed to in this more global sense tied to various ideas.
Well, you raise the question that I think we would have discussed more had Deborah Levy been with us, which is whether there is necessarily a congruence between a set of cultural preferences and a set of political preferences. And the talk of values tends to elide the two in a way that can be a little deceptive. I mean, one of the questioners has just posted a question that I thought was interesting, inviting us to think about Russia's role in all of this. I mean, culturally, there seems to me to be no question of the integrated part that Russian literature, Russian music, art played in any definition of European culture.
This is beyond Europe. What Mark is describing is beyond Europe.
Well, but so there is this question now about whether does Europe, what does Europe mean at all in cultural terms when you have 12-year-olds whose primary reading matter is Japanese manga comics in English? I mean, they're reading that more than anything that came out in Italian or German. So does Europe sorry, go ahead.
What Mark is describing is much more an institution that opted for internationalization, and you can have the East, the West, the South, the North, everywhere. And we don't have only American students, we don't have only European students, we have a lot of Asian students as well, and Latin American students. So what you call internationalization, Mark, of the nation, I would say the transnationalization, because it's much more a horizontal phenomenon, the connection, their relation among themselves, and maybe internet to some extent, and also all these networks, they are traveling along these networks. So, and they are sharing this I wouldn't say values, but tests, some vocabulary, rhetoric, and they are just one kind of thing. This is what I see the transnationalization. I'm not talking about just immigrants, but also you can have some music like this. Indian, the Hollywood, the Indian soap opera. What is it? Hollywood. All these new tests that are developing among these kids too. Generational phenomenon and class phenomenon. Sciences Po opts for the elite, and the elite network plays the same thing. They listen to the same music all over the world. They come for 3 years to Sciences Po, they spread, and then the networks exist. So this is a classical phenomenon, but it's much more dense. And maybe Europe, in this sense, through education, can play a role in the globalization. But
what this conversation makes me wonder as we come to a close, and I'd really like your thoughts about this, is whether this whole talk about European values and European culture isn't itself an artifact of the past. I mean, when I read this, and I understand, Magali, you want to, if I understand, argue for putting it on a different basis. But when I read these declarations from 1973 or even from the 1990s, they speak to me of a different era that has almost no connection with how people actually consume culture today, or identify culturally, or identify themselves morally. The invocation that you should, if done in the right way, think of yourselves as European seems somehow superfluous in settings. And I haven't really thought about it quite in those terms until our conversation.
Yes, you're right. But again, yeah, in 73, there was a very big incentive to sort of try to create a European identity in order to reply to some weaknesses in the project, so that it didn't quite work, or that it belongs to a distant past doesn't strike me as a problem, precisely if the community is yet to be achieved, or still to be achieved, or if it's an ongoing project. It doesn't really matter that what was said in 73 actually didn't or strikes us as an old thing, Now, I don't know about the fact that all these values are obsolete. I don't know. I still believe that representative democracy may have some good chances, or that it might be worth fighting for a representative democracy. I still don't think that human rights are a thing of the past, and I still think that human rights maybe, or respect for human rights, maybe something that we could fight for or still want to achieve. And human rights, of course, have themselves evolved from the list and the representation from the 70s. So no, I may be old and obsolete myself, but some of the values of the European Union still seem to me to be future oriented projects to be realized, rather than all things from the past to be forgotten in order to move on and listen to some music. I don't know, but
I'm sorry. The question is not whether the values are good or bad, because I agree with you on all of those values. The question is what is gained by describing them as European values?
Well, that's maybe, but that would be something that, something that I defend. It may be a way to make Europeans more proud of Europe and less ashamed of Europe. Because I think that the young generation, but again, you are talking about your students in Sciences Po, and I'm talking about my students at Paris 1 in philosophy, which they are probably less of the elite, but they are very much from the liberal left, I think. So they're not representative either. But they are very much ashamed of the way Europe is treating migrants, for instance. And I think that this kind of shame instead of pride in precisely some of the way we enact our values, that would be something to change, or we need to modify or transform the way we think that the way we relate to these values as they are enacted by Europe: tolerance, solidarity, reciprocity, welcoming refugees, creating solidarity with the most vulnerable, and not having this fortress union or this deregulated market, and instead working towards a more political project. That would be something that young people may find enticing, or they may want to get involved in this project.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that right at the end, because it seems to me that the rise of identity politics globally leaves us with this ambiguity of whether we're to understand it as a form of political engagement or as a form of individualism. That is, that it's not collective identity that is motivating action out in politics, but that that the concern about one's personal identity, this repli sur soi, is in this generation really depoliticizing people, except for particular engagements that engage them at the level of how they've defined themselves and their identities. So to be motivated by, let's say, LGBT politics, if that's all that you're engaged with and then withdraw, that's not the basis for a wider politics. But me, I'm torn on this question. I just don't know what the right answer is. Whether the depoliticizing potential of identity politics is stronger or weaker than the potentially politicizing forces that it could unleash.
We're coming to the end of our time. I wonder if any of the speakers would like any last words or reflections before we wrap up.
I think the whole question of identity is this tension that Mark is describing. All the tension, and not only individual, but collective, community identity, European identity, national identity, European identity, all identities is this tension between repli sur soi and opening. So opening will bring new dynamics because the identity is a dynamic phenomenon. Its politicization will bring it much more into a closure or more opening. So I think all identity is a basis for anxiety at every level. And this anxiety is explained by this tension that is between opening and repli sur soi. I don't know, you said it in French, so I say it in French. I wouldn't know how to say it in English. So I think it's always, it will remain an open question, and I think it will depend on how we are going to define based on the engagement of individuals and groups and communities, and even, I would say, nations and states and Europe. So I'm taking to every level this engagement for an identity formation or identification with a cause.
Magali or Mark, would you like to say anything?
No, the words identification with the cause are nice words to end with, I think.
Because it's political, European political project, right?
Exactly.
Well, then it remains for me to thank all three of you very much. You've made me think a lot, and I think you've made a lot of other people think. So I'm very grateful to you all for taking the time to have this conversation. Thank you. And I'm going to hand back now to Marie Dorigny. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, everybody. On behalf of my colleagues at the Columbia Global Centers in Paris and the European Institute and the Alliance program, thank you very much for joining us today for a very interesting and illuminating debate, and for your questions and engaged participation. I'd like to thank our panelists, Magali Bessone, Mark Lilla, Riva Kastoryano, and our moderator, Mark Mazower. And finally, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Institute for Ideas and Imagination, the Columbia Alumni Association, the Columbia Maison Française, Columbia University Libraries, the European Legal Studies Center at Columbia Law School, and Le Grand Continent, Erasmus Plus program of the European Union, the advisory board of the Paris Global Center. Our final theme in this series will be Can Europe Be Sovereign on March 2nd with Thierry Grillet, who will be interviewing Pierre Aski, who's a journalist and the founder of Rue 89. And on March 9th, a panel featuring Anu Bradford, European Legal Studies Center at Columbia, David Goodhart, a journalist, Boris Rouge, Munich Security Conference, and Dominique Régnier from Sciences Po in a debate moderated by Carlo Inverzini at Ceti City College of New York. Thank you very much. Good night to the Parisians. Have a good afternoon to the Americans. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.